really doesn't matter why you're in prison, but what you do with your time there. Starting off our list today, we have Christopher Scarver, the man who in 1994 took the life of none other than Jeffrey Dahmer while serving time at the Columbia Correctional Institute in Wisconsin for killing a man named Steve Loman in 1990. The pair arrived at the prison around the same time, and right away Scarver detested Dahmer. But he was also kind of scared of him. I mean, I really don't blame him. Dahmer did kill 17 people and consume the body parts of a number of his victims as well. So yeah, Scarver kept his distance until one night when he, Dahmer, and another inmate by the name of Jesse Anderson, who was jailed for killing his wife, were made to clean the bathrooms of the prison, during which time Scarver went to grab a mop. And when he returned, he saw Anderson and Dahmer laughing. He snapped and he grabbed a metal bar and he struck Dahmer twice, and then he beat Anderson both to death. In an interview, Scarver later claimed that he had become repulsed by Dahmer's behavior, his jokes, and the way he often organized his food to look like a human body in the prison cafeteria. After killing Dahmer and Anderson, Scarver was given 2 more life sentences. Next up, we've got James Elliott, who on March 18th of 2017 beat Donald Harvey, aka the Angel of Death, to death inside of Harvey's own cell. So, who is James Elliott and who was Donald Harvey? Well, James Elliott was a burglar, and Donald Harvey was a serial killer who worked as a nurse's aide and often smothered his victims to death with pillows. While Harvey claims to have killed around 70 people, he was only ever convicted of killing 37, which is not a small number by any means, but of course Harvey claims it was more, as they always do. Anyways, in March of 2017, Elliott entered Harvey's cell and beat him inches away from death. Harvey later died of his injuries, and Elliott confessed to killing him, claiming that he had wanted to do something constructive for the friends and neighbors he had stolen from, and that he had also wanted the attention of prison officials because he was unhappy with the quality of life in the penitentiary, as were many other of the inmates there. The act was premeditated, and Elliott was given a life sentence for killing, which was a big step up from the time he was serving for burglary. Next up, we have Thomas Terrible Tommy Silverstein and Clay Fountain, who on the same day, separately, fatally attacked prison guards escorting them through the grounds of Marion Prison. Both events took place on October 22nd of 1983, with the first attack being at the hands of Terrible Tommy, who had originally been arrested on charges of armed robbery, but had since caused 2 other deaths behind bars. That day, Tommy was being escorted to his cell by a prison guard named Merle Klutz when another inmate handed Tommy a shank, which he then used to impale Klutz 40 times, killing him. Just 8 hours later, in the same prison, Clay Fountain was being transferred by Robert Hoffman and 2 other guards when he was handed a shank by a fellow inmate, which he then used to attack the guards. Hoffman managed to save 2 of them before being attacked himself, after which he made his way to his son, another guard at the prison, before dying in his arms. This was the first and only time that 3 officers were killed on the same day in the same prison in 2 separate incidents. After the attack, Marion Prison went into a 23-year super lockdown that consisted of strict prisoner confinement to their cells, and both Tommy and Clayton were placed into solitary confinement in soundproof cells where the lights were kept on for 24 hours a day. Next up, we have James E. Day, who took the life of fellow inmate Nathan Leopold, a former child prodigy who, prior to the spring of 1924, met a man named Richard Leob. Richard and Nathan quickly became close. So close, in fact, that rumors began circulating about whether or not the two had entered into an intimate relationship, although both men adamantly denied this. During their time spent together, both Nathan and Richard became increasingly obsessed with the idea of carrying out the perfect crime, and so on May 21st, they decided to give it a shot. They forcibly took a young man from his home, killed him with a chisel, and then disposed of his body. They then sent a ransom note to the man's parents, who had at that time already contacted police. The two were sentenced to life in prison for the killing, with an additional 99 years each for forcible confinement, while guards were ordered to keep Richard and Nathan, who had turned on each other very aggressively during the course of the trial, apart. They eventually ended up together, as they seem to, and they even started a school while inside the prison. One night while Richard was showering, James Day came into the shower and he slashed him 50 times with an old-fashioned shaving razor. He claimed that Richard had made a pass at him, but considering the fact that Day had attacked Richard from behind, police believe that the true motive is still unknown. Now, usually at the halfway point, I try to keep things light, but today, that's not the case. On October 1st of 2011, two inmates worked together to take the life of a fellow inmate, Mitchell Harrison, in an incredibly gruesome and drawn-out way. Both perpetrators, Nathan Mann and Michael Parr, had been serving life sentences for killing when Harrison arrived at the prison to serve an intermediate sentence for the violation of a young woman. One night, presumably after discovering what Harrison had been booked for, Mann and Parr lured Harrison into their jail cell, held him down, and cut his throat using plastic cutlery and a razor blade. They then impaled him in the eye with a pen before removing his internal organs. The two had plans to share in eating Harrison's liver, but decided against it when met with the organ face to face. In the past, Parr had alluded to fantasies of eating parts of another human, but it seems as though when actually given the opportunity, he decided that it likely wouldn't be all it was cracked up to be. That's disgusting. Okay, for this next one, I'm gonna switch things up just a bit because instead of an evil prisoner committing a crime in jail, this one is actually about an evil prison guard, or an evil group of prison guards, rather. You see, in 2009, a man named Rocrast Mack was arrested for attempting to sell $10 worth of an illicit substance to an undercover police officer. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 20 years in prison to be served at the Ventress Correctional Facility in Clayton, Alabama, which was built to house just 650 prisoners, but at the time of his incarceration was well over capacity as it held 1,665. On the night of August 4th in 2010, during a nightly head count, a guard by the name of Melissa Brown accused Mack of partaking in some adult extracurricular activities with his hand under his blanket. You guys know what I mean. When he told her that wasn't true, she struck him twice with her baton, which led to Mack in turn hitting her in the lip. He then ran away but stopped when ordered to halt by another guard. He was then taken to the dorm lobby and surrounded by Lieutenant Mitchell Smith along with 5 other guards who took turns beating him into a coma, which eventually led to his death. Lieutenant Smith, who had been accused of brutality on at least 4 previous occasions, was charged with killing, as well as 2 other guards were also charged with killing who partook in the beating. What happened to the rest of them, I don't know, probably got off scot-free. You guys know how it is. Next up, we have Joseph Druce, who on August 23rd of 2003 killed a priest. Well, an ex-priest, I guess. You see, in January of 2002, Boston-born Catholic priest John Gohan was convicted of doing that stereotypical priest thing involving young men. Gohan was convicted on 1 count of the crime, but accused of 130. Not only that, but 86 plaintiffs also filed a $10 million lawsuit against the Archdiocese of Boston because of what Gohan had done. He was put into protective custody, but he still shared a cell, and with none other than Joseph Druce, a self-proclaimed racist who had been sentenced to life in prison after killing a man who had picked him up while hitchhiking. After claiming that the former priest had made a pass at him, Druce decided to block the door of their cell and then kill him by forcibly restricting his airways and then stomping him to death. Many people believe that the guards on duty actually turned a blind eye to the event, as when it happened there was only 1 guard on duty, there's usually 2, but that 1 guard did nothing to intervene in the situation. So it seems that they were not totally opposed to these actions. Next up, we have Robert Stewart, a violent prisoner with a past of psychological issues, violence, and racism. On March 31st of 2001, Robert was moved into the cell of Zahid Mubarak, who had been sentenced to just 90 days in prison for stealing just $12 worth of razor blades and was of Pakistani descent. That night, Stewart, who had already impaled another inmate to death and had records of over 186 incidents of violence acts, and had records of over 186 incidents of violent acts since his incarceration, broke the leg off a table and beat Mubarak to death. After the incident, Stewart was moved into isolation, where he marked the symbol of a well-known hate group onto the floor before falling asleep 30 minutes later, showing absolutely no signs of remorse. An investigation was launched to look into whether or not the prison should be held responsible due to negligence, and protocols were then put in place for high-risk prisoners to avoid future incidents. Next up, we've got Jimmy Farah and Dennis Eversole, who in March of 1975 brutally killed fellow inmate Charles Schmid while serving time in the Arizona State Prison in Florence. Charles Schmid was a short man who often stuffed his boots with flattened cans and newspapers so that he would appear taller. He was sentenced to life in prison after violating and killing 3 young women during the 1960s alongside his accomplices, his girlfriend Mary French and his friend John Saunders. Jimmy Farah, one of Schmid's assailants, was in jail for killing in the 2nd degree and attacking someone with a deadly weapon, and the other, Dennis Eversole, for armed robbery. During the trio's time in jail, Schmid maintained a fondness for annoying other inmates, and so one day both Farah and Eversole snapped. They attacked Schmid, impaling him 20 times with a blade, causing him to lose both an eye and a kidney at the time, and his life just 10 days later. And finally, we have Fotios Frediguias and Paul J. Decalogero, who on October 30th of 2018 beat James Whitey Bulger to death using a belt with a lock attached to it in the USP Hazleton prison in West Virginia, while a 3rd inmate, Sean McKinnon, stood watch. Frediguias was a former mafia hitman and Paul De Cologero a Massachusetts gangster. The pair killed Bulger likely after learning that he had been working as an informant for the FBI. Big no-no in prison. At the time of his death, Bulger had been serving a life sentence for killing 11 people as well as committing many other crimes in relation to the Irish Mafia. What's interesting about this particular case is that it hasn't actually gone to trial yet. Both Fotios Frediguias and Paul J. Decalogero are set to go to court in West Virginia in December of 2024, which is this year, so, you know, if you're interested, keep up on the case. Stay tuned.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Jason Barnum. Jason Barnum, also known as Eyeball due to his tattooed right eye, is a figure who has gained notoriety for his life of crime and distinctive appearance. Born in Alaska, Barnum's life took a dark turn as he succumbed to a struggle with addiction and criminal activities. In 2012, Barnum's life of crime culminated in a series of events that would land him in a maximum security prison. He was involved in a string of burglaries, car thefts, and a shooting incident with the police that left an officer injured. His actions during this crime spree demonstrated a dangerous disregard for human life and the law. During his court proceedings, the judge, while acknowledging Barnum's difficult upbringing and struggles with addiction, sentenced him to 22 years in prison for his crimes. In our number 9 spot today, we have Alexander Pichushkin. Alexander Pichushkin is a figure of terror known by the spine-chilling epithet the chessboard killer. His goal, as horrifying as it was unique, was to take a life for each space on a chessboard, a total of 64 individuals. This chilling ambition set him apart from other criminals and made him a feared figure not only in his operating base of Moscow, but also around the world. Alexander's reign of terror was marked by a level of brutality that left a trail of carnage in his wake. His victims were not merely killed, they were subjected to violent deaths that really showed the depth of his ruthlessness. The authorities eventually convicted him for 48 killings, however, Pichushkin himself claims a higher count, insisting that his total stands at 60 victims. Whether this claim is the truth or an attempt to inflate his notoriety remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the sheer scale of his crimes, coupled with his terrifying goal, makes him a figure of dread. His chilling ambition and the brutal reality of his crimes make Alexander Pichushkin a prisoner whose release would be a nightmare come true. In our number 8 spot today, we have Richard Lee McNair. Richard Lee McNair is a name that has become synonymous with cunning escapes and audacious evasion. Convicted for killering and burglary in the 80s, McNair's story took a turn for the extraordinary when he demonstrated a knack for escaping prison. Not once, but 3 times. His most infamous escape was from a maximum security prison in Louisiana in 2006. In a plot that seemed straight out of a Hollywood movie, McNair slipped out of the prison work detail by mailing himself out of the prison in a crate. Once outside, he managed to evade capture for over a year, leading authorities on a nationwide manhunt. McNair's ability to charm and deceive, coupled with his physical fitness, made him a formidable fugitive. His escapes and subsequent recaptures were widely covered in the media, earning him a reputation as a real-life escape artist. Finally captured in Canada in 2007, McNair is now held in the Supermax prison ADX Florence in Colorado. His story serves as a chilling reminder of the lengths some prisoners will go to regain their freedom. Richard Lee McNair is undoubtedly a figure you pray never escapes again. In our number 7 spot today, we have Terry Nichols. Terry Nichols is a name that sends chills down the spine of anyone familiar with the horrific Oklahoma City bombing. Nichols, along with his accomplice Timothy McVeigh, orchestrated one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in US history. On April 19, 1995, a truck exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people and injuring hundreds more. Nichols, a former army buddy of McVeigh's, was deeply involved in the planning and preparation of the attack. His anti-government sentiments and extremist beliefs fueled his participation in this act of terror. Following the attack, Nichols was quickly apprehended and brought to justice. In a trial that gripped the nation, Nichols was convicted of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, as well as other charges relating to the seriousness of his crimes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and is currently held in the ADX Florence maximum security prison in Colorado, the same one we just talked about. In our number 6 spot today, we have Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway is a name that evokes a chilling sense of dread and is notoriously known as the Green River Killer. This ominous moniker stems from his gruesome modus operandi, which involved leaving the bodies of his victims along the Green River in Washington. The river, once a symbol of natural beauty, became a grim reminder of Ridgway's merciless killing spree. Ridgway's crimes were not sporadic instances of violence, but a series of premeditated killings that made him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Officially, he was convicted of 49 crimes, but the actual number of his victims is believed to be at least double that count. What made Ridgway even more terrifying was not just the scale of his crimes, but also his attitude towards them. In a chilling display of lack of empathy, Ridgway confessed his crimes without any visible signs of emotion or remorse. This cold-blooded confession provided a terrifying insight into the mind of a remorseless killer, revealing a man devoid of any empathy or guilt for his heinous actions. The enormity of his crimes, coupled with his emotionless demeanor, makes Gary Ridgway a prisoner whose release would be a horrifying prospect. His chilling legacy continues to haunt those familiar with his story, making him a figure whose freedom is preyed against. In our number 5 spot today, we have Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader is more widely recognized by his chilling moniker BTK, an abbreviation which disturbingly describes his preferred method of killing. Rader's reign of terror spanned over 17 years in Wichita, Kansas, a time during which he took a perverse pleasure in his horrific acts, savoring the terror he instilled in the hearts of residents. Rader wasn't merely a man who committed heinous crimes, he was a sadist who reveled in his victims' suffering and the dread he inspired. His chilling letters to the police, where he arrogantly flaunted his crimes, added an extra layer of psychological terror to his spree. The letters served as a chilling reminder of his presence, keeping the community in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. These communications revealed a deeply disturbed mind, one that was not just content with the physical act of his horrific crimes, but also sought to manipulate and terrorize an entire community. Rader's pleasure in his cruel actions, his taunting letters, and the psychological torment he subjected Wichita to make the thought of this man walking free a very unsettling prospect, and one that will probably never come true, thankfully. In our number 4 spot today, we have Cleophas Prince Jr. In the shadowy realm of San Diego's suburban streets lurked a menacing phantom during the 1990s. Cleophas Prince Jr., at the time known as the Claremont Killer, turned the 90s into a real-life horror show. Over 9 dreadful months, he embarked on a relentless hunt, marking women as his prey in the seemingly serene Claremont neighborhood. To do this, he would either break into their homes when they least expected it, or sweet-talk them into some quiet, out-of-the-way spot. During his reign of terror, while the local news was all over it, the rest of the world hardly blinked. During this time, the stage of national and international press was captivated by other monstrous players such as Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, which casted a horrific shadow that eclipsed the terrifying exploits of Cleophas. Thankfully, however, in September 1990, thanks to some top-notch detective work and breakthroughs in forensic science, they finally pinned the tail on the donkey. Cleophas Prince Jr., Mr. Claremont Killer himself, got nabbed. The courts threw the book at him, and now he is chilling behind bars for the rest of his days. No parole, no second chances. In our number 3 spot today, we have Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Also known as the Padrino Matador, he is a Brazilian serial killer who is believed to have killed over 70 people, mostly other criminals, in the 1960s and the 1970s. He had a very difficult childhood as his father was a notorious criminal who actually really sadly harmed and killed his mother, and this of course had a profound influence on Pedro and his life. This experience is believed to have contributed to his violent behavior later in life. Pedro began his crime spree at a super young age, and he started with a horrific crime when he killed the vice mayor of his town, who he believed was responsible for the death of his girlfriend. He continued to kill other criminals, often targeting those who had previously wronged him or his family. Pedro was arrested in 1973 and was eventually convicted of killing 71 people. He is currently serving a prison sentence in Brazil and is known for his outspoken and unrepentant attitude towards his crimes. While I am sure we can all feel sympathy for the things that Pedro experienced in life, it truly is no excuse for the things that he chose to do. In our number 2 spot today, we have Charles Ng. Charles Ng is a name that will send chills down the spine, and he was a key player in the reign of terror that unfolded in the 1980s. Alongside his equally terrifying accomplice, Leonard Lake, Ng played a significant role in a series of crimes that remain etched into the annals of criminal history for their sheer depravity and cruelty. The grim saga began when Ng and Lake joined forces to unleash a wave of horror that would haunt their victims and the public alike. Their modus operandi was chilling. Unsuspecting individuals would be lured into their grasp only to be subjected to unimaginable torture, their final moments filled with fear and agony. What made their reign of terror even more horrifying was the duo's penchant for recording their despicable acts. These videos served as a chilling testament to their inhumanity, a grotesque spectacle of their victims suffering under their hands. Ng's role in these crimes was not that of a mere spectator. He was a very active participant, his cold-blooded nature making him a figure of dread. This, combined with his seeming indifference to the pain and suffering of his victims, made him one of the most feared inmates in the prison system. His heinous acts have left a dark stain on his name, making Charles Ng a prisoner that many pray to never see free again. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, a figure shrouded in infamy and widely recognized by his chilling moniker, the Son of Sam. He struck fear into the heart of New York City in the late 1970s. His name became synonymous with a wave of terror that swept through the city as he embarked on a series of shootings that left the public in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. Berkowitz's crimes were not random acts of violence. They were methodically planned and executed with a chilling precision that left the authorities baffled and the public on edge. Each attack added to the growing panic, creating an atmosphere of dread that permeated the city. But it wasn't just his crimes that made Berkowitz a figure of terror. His claims of demonic possession added a layer of horror to his already frightening persona. These claims, whether true or the product of a deranged mind, painted a picture of a man under the influence of dark forces, making him an even more unsettling figure. The combination of his heinous crimes, alleged demonic possession, and erratic behavior made him a prisoner that one would fervently pray never walks free again.
And we're starting off with Eric Rudolph. Eric Rudolph is known for his involvement in a series of bombings in the United States during the 1990s. These acts, violence which targeted innocent civilians, were carried out due to his twisted political agenda. He was setting out to purify a world he believed was sinful, wanting to get rid of those he felt were undeserving of God's love. His most notorious attack was the bombing at the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta, where he planted an explosive that killed one person and injured over 100 others. In addition to the Olympic attack, Rudolph was responsible for a string of attacks at a clinics and lesbian nightclub. He was motivated by pure hatred, just wanting to further his agenda through violence. And what makes Rudolph's case even more disturbing is the fact that he managed to evade capture for years, fueling this ongoing anxiety and fear in the communities he targeted. He was finally arrested in 2003 though, now serving 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Next up we have Dennis Rader. This guy is just pure evil, plain and simple. He'd call himself BTK. As for what that stands for, just Google it. Pretty messed up that someone would be proud to refer to themselves that way. He committed a series of heinous crimes over several decades in Wichita, Kansas. Rader's deeds, which included the brutal unalivings of innocent people, just showed a complete disregard for human life. And what makes his case even more disturbing was his ability to blend into society as this seemingly average, unsuspecting neighbor and family man. He was a church leader, a facade which allowed him to gain the trust of his victims. And this is like part of why when people make claims after someone does something really terrible, like, oh, he never could have done something like that, he was so normal, he was so upstanding, so blah blah blah. Evil comes in many forms and wears many different masks. That's why it's so insidious. Now, Rader's obsession with power and control over others led to him to commit unspeakable acts, but his evil extended beyond the physical harm he inflicted. He also taunted law enforcement and the public through these chilling letters and messages, just reveling in the fear and torment he was creating. Number 8, Charles Cullen. So this guy was a nurse, and he's on this list. So this is one of those creepy cases where someone working in the medical field is secretly harming their patients. People have put their complete trust and faith in them. Really sickening. Over the course of his nursing career, he administered lethal doses of medications to patients under his care, ultimately causing the deaths of an estimated 40 or more patients, possibly even in the hundreds. His crimes spanned across multiple hospitals, making it tough for authorities to initially identify the extent of his actions. And as for his motivations, they remain somewhat murky, but it is clear that he derived some form of satisfaction from exerting control over life and death within this hospital setting. Families were left devastated, and fellow hospital staff were confused and began to become suspicious of the sudden and unexpected deaths of these patients. And ultimately, Cullen's spree ended when he was arrested in 2003. He's now serving 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole until 2403. The American justice system is really weird. Like, just say he's never getting out. Next up, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, infamously known as the Son of Sam, committed a string of brutal crimes in the mid-70s that terrorized New York City. He was responsible for a series of shootings that left 6 people dead and several others injured. Berkowitz's actions were driven by a twisted compulsion that led him to randomly target innocent victims, mostly young couples in parked cars. What makes Berkowitz's crimes particularly chilling and very bizarre is his claim that he was following the orders of his neighbor's dog, which he believed was possessed by a demon. I think he was pinning the whole demon possession thing on the wrong place. I was going to say on the wrong person, but a dog, not really a person. What really made this guy so scary, though, was just how random his attacks were and his ability to elude capture for an extended period, which left New Yorkers living in dread for this possible next attack. Berkowitz was finally apprehended in 1977, and he is currently serving 6 consecutive life sentences, just in case he dies and is reborn again. Number 6, Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, commonly known as the Green River Killer, is a notorious criminal who terrorized the state of Washington during the 80s and 90s. He was responsible for the unalivings of at least 49 women, although he later confessed to taking the lives of even more victims. Ridgway carried out his crimes by targeting vulnerable women, primarily workers of the night and runaways, whom he would lure, often by showing them pictures of his son, to gain their trust before violently attacking them and discarding them like trash in remote locations. What makes Ridgway's crimes even more horrifying is the cold-blooded and calculated manner in which he hunted his victims. He often even returned to the dumping grounds, and as to what he did there, not something I can or want to get into here, but suffice to say, this guy belongs exactly where he is now. He managed to evade capture for nearly 2 decades, but was finally apprehended in 2001 through DNA evidence and his own admissions. He struck a plea deal providing information about the location of his victims' remains in exchange for a life sentence, avoiding the death penalty. Next on the list is Kristen Gilbert, another nurse. Over the course of several years, she intentionally administered fatal doses of medication to patients under her care, leading to their premature deaths. She would inject their IV bags with high doses of epinephrine, causing cardiac arrest. Nurses actually noticed a higher than normal amount of deaths with patients in her care, but initially just thought it was a coincidence and would give her the nickname Angel of Death as a joke. It's not uncommon for people working in very intense working environments like hospitals to have a bit of a dark sense of humor in order to cope, but in hindsight, that's pretty morbid. Imagine looking back on that after the fact, having made that joke and being like, oh damn, yeah, that was more accurate than we thought. She was very calculated in her actions, exploiting her position within the hospital. She used her authority to carry out her crimes, all while evading suspicion for a long time. In terms of her motivations for doing what she did, I mean, what possible motive would ever make sense for something like this? Maybe she had a desire for control, power. Doesn't really make a difference anyway. There's not really any motivation that would make any of this forgivable, let alone okay. Gilbert was eventually caught when coworkers started catching on to her, prompting an investigation that led to her arrest. And at number 4 is Wayne Williams. Born on May 27, 1958 in Atlanta, Williams grew up with an interest in radio and journalism. But his supposed connection to the Atlanta unaliving, specifically the homicides of 29 young people, both male and female, are what he's most well known for. Between 1979 and 81, a series of disappearances and discoveries of bodies in rivers and wooded areas shocked the Atlanta community. These victims displayed signs of strangulation or asphyxiation. In 1981, Wayne Williams came under police scrutiny when he was stopped on a bridge above the Chattahoochee River. During this encounter, investigators found fibers in his vehicle that were believed to match those discovered on some of the victims, and as a result, Williams was arrested and charged with the deaths of 2 adults, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Payne. In 1982, Williams faced trial and received 2 life sentences. Law enforcement were adamant that by apprehending Williams, they had also solved many of the cases involving the young people, even though he could only solely be tied to the 2 adult victims, and there was no real evidence to support his involvement in those other cases. His sentencing is still controversial to this day, as Williams claimed the KKK had actually been responsible. All of these victims, the 2 adults and the missing young people, had been African American, and Williams believed the true circumstances of the case had been covered up by authorities. Next up, we have Joseph D'Angelo Jr. D'Angelo Jr., a former police officer, gained infamy as the Golden State Killer, born on November 8, 1945 in Bath, New York. He would go on to commit a series of horrifying crimes that terrorized California communities from 1974 to 1986. His spree included burglaries, SA, and murders. He would often break into homes, tying up and terrorizing his victims before committing these acts. Over the years, his crimes remained unsolved. It was only in 2018 that he was finally arrested and identified through DNA evidence. In June of 2020, Joseph D'Angelo pleaded guilty to numerous charges. On August 21st, 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never be released to harm others again. Number 2, Robert Hansen. Born on February 15th, 1939 in Estherville, Iowa, he operated in Anchorage, Alaska during the 70s and early 80s. Hansen's crimes primarily targeted young women. His method involved luring his victims with promises of money or employment. Then he would abduct and transport them to a remote wilderness area, and there, things would play out like a real-life horror movie. He would release them and then hunt them down like animals, subjecting them to unspeakable acts of violence. He is known to have taken the lives of at least 17 women, although the true number of his victims may be much higher. His crimes went undetected for years due to his careful planning and knowledge of the Alaskan wilderness, but his capture came in 1983 when one of his intended victims actually managed to escape. This led to a search of Hansen's property where evidence, including jewelry belonging to some of the missing women, was discovered. In February of 1984, Robert Hansen was arrested. In a plea agreement, he confessed to his crimes and provided information on the locations of his victims' remains. In return for his cooperation, Hansen received a 461-year prison sentence without the possibility of parole. And finally, we have the Ripper Crew. The Ripper Crew were a group of 4 individuals responsible for a series of gruesome crimes in Chicago during the early 80s. The group consisted of Robert Gett, Edward Spreitzer, Andrew Coco Reales, and Thomas Coco Reales, terrorizing the city with their gruesome acts of violence. Their crimes primarily involved the abduction and unaliving of women. The victims were subjected to unspeakable acts of violence. The group's name, Ripper Crew, was a name they coined themselves, as they would sometimes dismember their victims. It was even said they would consume parts of their body in ritualistic ceremonies. The members of the Ripper Crew were arrested in 1982 and 83 after law enforcement agencies launched an extensive investigation into their activities. Evidence including statements from the perpetrators themselves and the recovery of victims' remains linked them to the crimes. Everyone received proper sentences for the most part, but Thomas Coco Reales was released in 2019, and according to him, he's not a monster, which is incorrect.